William Marshall, it's wonderful to have you on the Herland Report. You used to work as an intelligence analyst and an investigator with the DEA, with private companies and also non-profit organizations for over 30 years. You worked cases for over 40 countries, different cases, before you joined the Judicial Watch as a senior investigator, and this is your current work. We take such interest in Judicial Watch. You were the ones that uncovered the DIA report from 2012, showing who's allied with who in the Syria war. You've done the Benghazi killings work, and you've looked into the Hillary Clinton Foundation. You've looked at Libya. You have so many interesting uncoverings from Judicial Watch, which for the viewer is the public watchdog here in the United States. We would argue the most successful one that looks into government corruption and a lot of those issues that are going on today. What would you say pertaining to George Soros?
Yes, well, thank you very much for having me on. George Soros has been a target or a subject of our investigations now for a couple of years. And in fact, we became particularly interested in George Soros' activities after foreign government officials, or former officials, approached us with concerns about his activities and those of his organizations in their countries and his meddling. And so we began to take a look at the collaboration in particular between our State Department and George Soros' activities. I think we've got investigations going on in probably 7 or 8 countries, and that will be expanding in 2019 in terms of the collusion, which is a favorite word these days in America, but the collusion between the State Department and George Soros' non-governmental organizations, these little NGOs that proliferate around the world. He's operating in several dozen countries, and literally hundreds of these little nonprofits, if you will, that are focused in the new media space primarily, but that they like to advocate very liberal leftist policies. They tend to be very anti-American in nature. They are pro-socialist. They advocate for the breakdown of traditional institutions. They push abortion, the legalization of abortion, the legalization of drug laws, or decriminalization of drug laws, marijuana, for example. They like to stir up young people and have them engage in violent protests, the Black Mask movement, for example, where they assault police officers with rocks and they burn down government buildings. They create mayhem. They like to have the young leftists align with the Muslim minority populations in many of these countries to form a sort of a green-red axis, which, for example, in Macedonia is a classic case of this. And George Soros inevitably aligns with politicians that are of a communist or a socialist bent. For example, I like to use the case of Albania, which has been devastated by George Soros' activities there. Albania has a wonderful conservative element that was very pro-American, very conservative, very traditional in their outlook. They believed in family and in faith. And unfortunately, there was they threw off communism, of course, in the early 1990s, and they embraced American values in many ways, and capitalism, free markets. But you had the reemergence of a sort of a revanchist communist party under the guise of socialism. The current prime minister is a man named Edi Rama. His father was a member of the Communist Politburo during the Soviet era. Okay, Edi Rama is a socialist, but I would argue like a crypto-communist who has, under his regime, has made Albania a hotbed for cannabis production, to the point where cannabis production surged, I want to say something like 300 to 500%. I might have my figure off there, but a tremendous amount, to the point where it's become the locus for cannabis production in Europe, Albania has become. thanks to the policies of Eddie Rahman.
It's a paradox too when you look at Afghanistan, for example. I mean, prior to U.S. entry to Afghanistan, the poppy fields, when the Taliban did not allow the growing of poppy fields, we have seen, since U.S. takeover of Afghanistan, the rise of heroin production in an unprecedented way. I do believe 90% of the world's heroin now comes from Afghanistan, and we know that the heroin trade into the United States is massive. Somebody at the top are earning billions of this $100 billion trade yearly. Look, I've lived in South America, I've lived in the Middle East. I originate from Africa, basically, born and raised in Africa. I travel the Far East. There's nowhere in the world where you see the young generation lying in the street. I think to 27 million Americans now on illicit drugs, and 7 out of 10 Americans on prescription drugs, and this is according to the Mayo Clinic. I mean, this is a massive, I know we're discussing George Soros, but since you're mentioning Albania there, I mean, now considering the issues on the southern border where the Democrats are fighting to have the illegal activity continued, it's really a big issue, all of this.
It's a tremendous problem in the United States, and you have fentanyl being flown in from China, which, you know, the opioid crisis in this country is worse than the crack epidemic was back in the 1980s. You have young, you know, and we're not talking about necessarily the lower stratum of society. I mean, in terms of economics, we're talking, you know, these are the people that are overdosing are often, you know, kids from affluent, you know, not that it's any better or worse, but it has a much more, it gets more media attention, I think, when you have, you know, young people from largely you know, the upper middle classes that are dying left and right, and to the point now where you know, they want everyone to carry Narcan, you know, this anti-overdose drug, which I find baffling. I mean, I would think that yes, I understand that we need to save people who have overdosed, but I think we need to address the root causes, why these people are using drugs in the first place. I mean, there are deeper societal issues, and we can't just put a Band-Aid on it by saying, well, everyone needs to carry around a dosage of Narcan with them in the event somebody dies of an overdose or has an overdose in front of them. But, you know, to the point about Soros, we've looked at him and his activities in Albania and Romania and Colombia and Guatemala, Poland, you know, all over, and we're finding that our State Department is meeting with Soros's representatives in places like Romania, where the former head of Open Society Foundation, which is the big Soros umbrella organization, the head of Open Society Foundation Romania, a man named Ovidiu Voicu, was the featured speaker in a State Department-sponsored conference call on open government partnership, right? So you have top George Soros operatives. You know, I mentioned Romania. Also in Albania, you had the top Soros guy there, a guy named Andy Debruschi, meeting with at the U.S. Embassy to have discussions with USAID and to help them direct U.S. taxpayer funds in the form of USAID grants to NGOs operating in Albania. So the question Americans should ask themselves is, why is our State Department using George Soros's operatives to direct U.S. taxpayer dollars to nonprofit organizations that are anti-American, that are espousing radical leftist, policies? It makes no sense. And yet, even under Donald Trump, we're seeing this collaboration between the State Department and Soros's organizations all over the world continuing. And in fact, it really brings home this notion that, unfortunately, President Trump does not have full control of our government. Certainly not the Justice Department and not the State Department. Even though you have a very good man in the form of Mike Pompeo as a Secretary of State, the State Department is riddled with these leftists, these Obama, acolytes,
It's interesting to look at the kind of socialism that is entering the United States now, and pertaining to George Soros. I mean, we all read Gene Sharp. We all have understood what the Arab Spring was. I mean, there shouldn't be anybody left that didn't, that are not aware at this point of how to create revolutions, and how leading hedge fund managers like Soros and other people coming from that elite of the very few individuals that are owning now most in the world, how it's so easy to take control. It's just to pay up some money, to speak to some oppositional groups in a particular country, instigate them, and then to start to riots in the street, and all of a sudden a lot of people get killed and all of that. We're used to that now, and it's long ago that initially started happening in the Arab Spring, and later we found out all about what the Tahrir Square was, and that uprising in Yugoslavia and Serbia and all of that. That's old news. But when you look at the way these globalists such as George Soros, then as a leading hedge fund manager, bets on a country going down, let's say Ukraine, for example. I mean, half of Wall Street are just very keen to listen to what he does, because whatever he does is very successful. Betting on a country going down, then already having prepared behind the scenes covertly for that country to go down through some color revolutions or whatever, and then in the aftermath of that, earning the billions.
Yes, he stirs up trouble. He stirs the pot and profits on the chaos that results. This is what he did, of course, with the British pound. You recall back in the early 1990s, he broke the back of the Bank of England and made $1 billion in one day as a result of that, shorting the British pound. So this is a playbook. These are all strategies that he pursues. It will be interesting to see if his sons, Jonathan and I think it's Alexander, pursue them as they take over the Open Society Foundation and his empire. It will be interesting to see if he ever leaves this earth, how his legacy will continue onward in terms of the chaos that he's created around the world. And he revels in this. I mean, you and I both know that he famously gave an interview to Steve Kroft on 60 Minutes in which he gloated, George Soros gloated about his work with the Nazi collaborators in his native Hungary when he was a teenager, helping identify the homes of fellow Jews. He himself is Jewish, of course. He was in the care of a Hungarian official pretending to be Christian, that is, George Soros was. His father had changed the family name from Schwartz to Soros. A lot of people don't know that, in order to hide their Jewish ethnicity. But he bragged about in this 60 Minutes interview about how he felt empowered. He felt tremendous, almost godlike powers in being able to assist in the identification of the homes of Jews so that their properties could be confiscated and that the Jews could be shipped off to the death camps. This is the mentality. I mean, I understand that a teenager in that situation, may be forced to do what he can to survive. But to say, 70 years after the fact, that he felt he was formed by that experience, and it became central to his character. What does that say about his character now?
And I do believe he also said those were the happiest days of his life, doing that work.
Yes.
Another thing we have heard from George Soros is that he views the engagement into the economic field or into the business field as it's above morality kind of question. And my view on the Constitution really is that it's the greatest Constitution that we have seen in the modern world. Traditional values that you had here in this country that ensured the rights of citizens is just unbelievable. And when you look into the kind of globalist, amoral society that rises above morality today, the capitalism of greed is what got us the financial crisis as well. The Protestant ethic that you should be an honest man, not steal and not lie, these values seem to be completely lost, and that is precisely some of what we see in George Soros.
Exactly. The founding fathers, and I go back to the founding of our country because they were such men of such genius. I have, I could read American history forever. I do. I read a lot of American history, and the theme that comes through in their writings is that the American people must always turn to God and morality. That must be at the heart of the American system. And you're precisely right to say that Soros has elevated this notion of amorality as though this is something to be aspired to. Certainly in his business dealings, he calls himself amoral. And then he says, well, I then use my wealth for what I guess he views as moral purposes through the Open Society Foundation in fomenting havoc in all of these countries around the world and trying to break down conservative institutions and conservative cultures and introduce this radical leftism. But that's precisely right. It was George Washington, I believe, who said that if America loses God, essentially America will be lost. Of course, I'm paraphrasing, but that was the essence of what he said, that we can never turn away from God.
So to what degree are these globalists profiting from the breakdown of democracy and amassing immense amounts of wealth precisely from the breakdown of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the respect for law and order? Because considering too that socialism already fell in the Soviet Union, we saw how communism did not work. We saw how a strong state that controls everything produces a society in which people are not free. So my question is, why is George Soros pushing for a society that is not democratic anymore?
It's a great question, because if you remember, Soros used to be against communism, against the Soviet Union. He was causing all kinds of problems for the Soviets. Soros sought the destruction of the USSR as well. So now he's changed his sights from communism or global communism to democracy and traditional Western culture, to break that down. So it seems contradictory in a sense, but I think that he wants to see just chaos and have the rise of an elite class of super wealthy individuals like himself, like many of the other billionaires that all for some reason always seem to gravitate towards socialism, which is something that has always somewhat perplexed me, is why these people who have benefited so tremendously from a free market system, people like Tom Steyer and Mark Zuckerberg and Tim Cook and all these other leftists, of course Jeff Bezos is a classic example. They love liberal policies and sort of this notion of spreading the wealth, and yet they themselves have been the biggest beneficiaries in the world of the free market system, of this notion that you pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Now, of course, Howard Schultz, the founder of Starbucks, who recently announced his candidacy for president of the United States, was shocked when the rest of the Democratic Party attacked him for jumping into the presidential race. He was truly flummoxed by this reaction that he got, that he was not welcome in the race, when this man who largely advocates liberal policies also believes in a strong work ethic and the power of the individual to raise. This is a man who lived in subsidized housing as a child, grew up very poor, Howard Schultz, and was a brilliant visionary, and he did a wonderful job of building a great company and a great brand, and has benefited tremendously from it. And yet the people that he aligns with politically, philosophically, the left rejected him outright because they feared, of course, that he would hew this sort of middle path and draw voters away from whoever the Democratic candidate is going to be in 2020, and which will result in the re-election of Donald Trump.
And it's interesting to see how well precisely socialism goes with the globalist class, because a globalist class of the ultra-rich are dependent upon a sleeping public. Mm-hmm. You have to be in control of the media as well, which is done excellently here in the United States and also, of course, in Europe nowadays. So I would argue that socialism fits that kind of globalist narrative very well, because socialism creates a very strong state that controls the people, or most of the people are employed. We can look that up in the Soviet Union and see how everybody were hired and worked under the very strong state. And then the question would be, who owns the state and who controls the state? So in my view, it's a very logical development that precisely the globalist elite would support that kind of structure. And we do see it very clearly in the United States now as well, with looking at the Democratic Party, Speaker of the House of Representatives Nancy Pelosi. If you check what she's for and what she's against, she's for every single thing that the ultra-rich benefit from. This has been the result of globalism. We've heard the talks, like we do from Soros too, about open society and democracy, but this globalist structure is dependent precisely on open border. So it's interesting when you follow her, for example, and it's a paradox because the Democratic Party was supposed to be the party for the legal worker. Now they are the party defending the illegal activity. They're defending not stopping the drug trail into the United States. So to me, it's really logical.
Well, the Democratic Party, I think, has so lost its way. I mean, they benefit. Of course, the Republicans are guilty of much of the problem too, because they, their interests, like the cheap labor that illegal, immigration represents. The Democratic Party see future voters in the waves of illegals coming across the border. I mean, I think it's axiomatic to say that a country cannot be a country if it does not have controlled and defensible borders. So, the great historical comparison that's used to America toward America today of America is the Roman Empire, when their borders eventually became so porous that they were overrun by barbarians, right? And that led to the collapse of the Roman Empire. Well, as President Trump has said on numerous occasions, a country that doesn't have borders is not a country. That's what defines any country. I think to see this great opposition to building a wall, which is a physical barrier, which is the only thing that's going to protect a 700-mile-long border, is remarkable. Especially when, as you say, the Democratic Party used to represent, the everyday worker, right, whose salaries are being downwardly pressured by the illegal immigrants coming across the border. You would think that they would embrace a wall to protect their own. Their own base, what used to be their own base. I would now argue that the base of the Republican Party is now largely comprised of the blue-collar working class in this country, which is ironic when you have a billionaire who's at the head of our government, who's the head of the Republican Party, because he understands them and they understand him.
It's going to be very interesting to keep following the development of American current affairs, and we will for sure follow the work of Judicial Watch as you uncover government corruption and seek to stop the elites misusing their power. So thank you very much, Mr. Marshall, for taking the time to joining us here at the Herland Report.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to discuss Judicial Watch's work. It's very important.